listening to the Digitally Irresistible podcast, where we cover the optimization of digital technologies and irresistible people. Brought to you by iCore. Each episode features someone who sheds a little more light on the ins and outs of delivering a great employee and customer experience that has a measurable impact on the business. And now, here's today's guest. Welcome to another episode of the Digitally Irresistible podcast. I'm your host, Bernie Borges. Today's guest is Daniel Burks. Welcome, Daniel.
Bernie, excited to be here.
Excited to have you, Daniel. Thank you so much for taking time to be with me. Daniel, you are an Army veteran. Thank you for your service. You are a seasoned retail management professional with over 2 decades of experience. In fact, since August of 1999, you have successfully led teams across some of the largest retailers globally. You have a passion for enhancing the customer experience and customer service excellence. And as a thought leader and a dynamic speaker, you bring valuable insights into the world of leadership development and impactful management. So on this episode, Daniel, let's unpack your approach to leadership in CX through a balanced approach of head and heart. But first, Daniel, let's unpack your backstory. Tell us your backstory.
Well, thank you. You know, the backstory question is always a really good one for me because you don't know where to start. But you know what? A lot of my life has been built around the folks that raised me. My grandparents raised me, both of them born during the Depression. And I think the sensibility that I bring to a lot of the things that I do was really started with those folks and that very simplistic kindness that they just apply to the world and to people in general has just been a big influence on me throughout my life. And after the military and as I moved into my professional career, I brought some of those sense and sensibilities to the way that I approach these large organizations, dealing with customers, working through customer service and customer experience. And ultimately, what I realized the most was that my forte, the thing that I enjoyed the most was teaching and growing managers and leaders to do better in those spaces and places as it dealt with growing their teams. So I've been just kind of leaning into that for the last 15, 20 years of just helping those folks just get better at what they do so that we can make those folks better and ultimately our customers have a better experience.
Yeah, Daniel, I love the fact that you bring your upbringing, your family values into your approach to your career. I think that speaks volumes to who you are just as an individual. So thank you for that backstory. Now, I know enough about your background that you've made a transition from managing people to actually leading managers. Why don't you speak to that some?
You know, as I was growing up in the industry and as I was doing more professionally to grow, you know, I made some assumptions, right? I made some assumptions by, you know, and honestly, I was led and managed by some of the best of the world. I was so blessed throughout my career to have folks that not only took the time to stop and recognize me, but then lean in and invest in me, you know, to grow my skill sets, or sometimes just be brutally honest and say, you know, you could have said that better. And as that happened throughout time, not only did I grow from that and appreciate that, but I found myself taking those key learnings, expanding upon them, making my own, and then passing them on. And so one day I kind of woke up and said, hey, listen, yes, I'm good at managing teams. Yes, I'm good at managing business processes. I feel like that I'm a lifetime learner. So therefore I'm becoming a better leader. But where I really find joy and happiness is when I see that light come on behind those rookie managers or those middle managers that have been struggling to really get the most out of their teams and build those relationships, helping them kind of bridge those gaps and to expand their knowledge. That has been the happy place and space that I found myself in. And I've just leaned into it. I've just worked really hard to make myself prepared to do those things and ultimately find every opportunity to invest in the folks around me that are leading these teams, because in today's world, I see that as one of the largest needs that we have out there that translates ultimately into how our customers are being serviced.
Yeah, that's a great point because as you know, as you've experienced and you experience every day, it's those leaders who are leading the people, especially on the front lines. And the people on the front lines are the ones that are actually delivering the great customer service, but they're not doing it effectively unless they have great leaders behind them, inspiring them, motivating them. So I love your thinking on that. Now I know that you have 5 key pillars to leadership that you teach. So I've asked you to come prepared to discuss each one of them and unpack them. So if we may, let's begin with the first one, and that's defining communicating expectations.
Absolutely. You know, I break management and leadership into 2 buckets, and that's probably something that a lot of folks struggle when you ask them what the difference is between management and leadership. And listen, if you have manager in your job title, there's an inherent expectation by your organization that you produce a certain level of results. There's KPIs, there's metrics, there's things that the company is hoping to gain from effective management of not only the people, but the process and the systems that you're responsible for. So I always say that you manage processes and you lead people. And those approaches are not always exactly the same. And so when you start talking that way, a lot of times folks, especially the managers that I'm coming across that are trying to grow and get better, seem to struggle. And so I started identifying some opportunities. The number one opportunity that I think that I see is that sometimes we'll promote folks to failure. They're really good at their role. Okay, they take on a management role now, and our hope is that person will translate some of that work ethic and expertise into that management role and hopefully duplicate it amongst the team that they're now currently managing. And what happens more often than not is these folks will get promoted into that role, and they'll either do one of 2 things. Okay, they'll try to adopt whatever was already in place, and that may or may not be very effective, or they start working one off. In other words, they try to do 5 or 6 other people's jobs in their management role to try to keep that performance very high. And so what I realized was that our managers, a lot of times our new managers, and even some that have been around for a while, if you sit them down and say, hey, listen, tell me what winning looks like, they really break it down for me, they struggle with it because they ultimately did not actually look at what they were trying to do and have an expectation of their own. They've got a boss or they got an SOP that's telling them some things, but they didn't actually sit down and go, what does that mean to me? And then how do I translate that to my team? So the first pillar is always you need to, as a leader of a group or team or an organization or a manager of, you yourself have to have an expectation. And until you can define that clearly for yourself, your team is never going to reach the levels of success that we hope for them.
So it's about setting those expectations, defining them with clarity, and then being able to communicate them. So love that.
Number one, starting with yourself, making sure that you know what winning looks like to you.
Right.
So pillar number 2 that you asked about was that communication. And then you're spot on. That you kind of summed it up really quickly there, but I will tell you that a lot of times we know what winning looks like in our mind, and we've done a terrible job of explaining it to our teams. And that's from a litmus test standpoint, that's the easiest one. Hey, what does winning look like? And if your associates or your team can't articulate it, there's a communications gap, right? One of my favorite quotes was by a guy named William White, and it said, the great enemy of communication we find is the illusion of it. We've thought we've communicated. Everybody's, assumes everybody else knows what right looks like. And then when you start asking probing questions, ultimately you realize that it's not true. And so effectively communicating those expectations is probably the most thought out thing that you have to do. Once you've kind of got inside the confines of what your company's asking for you to do as a manager of a team, okay, being able to make sure that everybody knows what their part is in that and what winning looks like, communicated that well, I said, is probably the hardest thing that most people struggle with.
Yeah, I heard an expression many decades ago that it's always been with me, Daniel, and that is that communication is the hardest thing we do in life. It's not limited to one aspect of life. It's just the hardest thing we do in life.
It's the hardest thing.
And so we spend, of course, most of our waking time in a work environment. So clearly communication in work is a big deal. It's a big deal. Yeah. Now, you touched on management versus leadership. Let's unpack that a little bit as well.
iCore's global team of CX experts is dedicated to partnering with our valued clients to achieve their vision. Whether you need steady state customer service, seasonal staffing, support for a new product launch, or fast response to events, the iCore team is flexible, service-oriented, and works collaboratively to design a CX strategy tailored to fit your unique needs. Consider iCore an extension of your team. If the unexpected happens, know that we'll face it together with determination and a smile. We're in this together every step of the way.
I think that's one of the toughest things we're seeing and facing the world today. And if you look at coming out of COVID, you had a bunch of folks that were working remote or working hybrid positions, or even the ones that decided to continue to go to work, but parts of their teams were somewhere else's. And the relationship between those groups, it really, in my opinion, brought to light how dysfunctional some of our management programs and processes were. Our ability to measure what success looks like, everybody knowing what success looks like, and then feeling good about those things in the day-to-day, whether it's all the Zoom calls and all the things that we went through. We found an entire country and really a world that struggled all of a sudden understanding how to manage those teams. And it wasn't so much that there was a difference in where these folks were working, as much as it was that no one was really managing the most important things. And so Peter Drucker had a quote a long time ago that said, "What gets measured gets managed." Okay. Well, I loved that quote, and I carried it around for me a long time. And then that turned into something else. What's measured gets managed. Okay. What's managed gets done, and what gets recognized gets repeated. Okay, so I'm going to say that again because a lot of folks really kind of have a tough time with that. So what gets measured, what gets managed gets measured. Okay, what gets measured gets done, and what gets recognized gets repeated. And from a management philosophy, okay, I try to carry that through everything that I'm doing. Are we measuring it? Okay, are we recognizing folks that are getting done? Okay, and are we managing it? Now, you manage processes, and you can do that almost through any industry. This is supposed to happen this way, this many times. And in most places and cases, you can identify if that's happening well, right? Where management leaves off and leadership picks up is that you manage with your heart. Okay, you lead with your mind, you manage with your heart. There's a lot of folks that struggle with having both of those conversations. Being able to talk to somebody and say, "Hey, listen, okay, here's what we're trying to do here. You're kind of missing the mark, Bernie. That's not okay, right?" That's purely a management conversation of saying, "Here's what you're getting measured to do. Here's what I'm paying you to do, and it's just not getting done, and that's not okay." I find that a lot of folks, especially in the younger generations, they struggle to have that candid conversation with their associate. But the next step of this, what I think is in more need than it's ever been, is, "Hey, Bernie, listen. Okay, now that we got that clear, you're better than this. I know that you're better than this. Hey, can you take a minute? Tell me what's going on. How can I help you here?" And a leader cares about the person as much, if not more, than the role. The role's got to get done. That's everybody that has a boss. They're expecting those jobs to get done. Okay, but many, many, many cases we forget how important it is to connect the heart to that person, because that old saying that no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. Right? Leadership is nothing more than taking people where they need to be through caring about them.
Yeah. So yes, and to everything you just discussed, Daniel.
Yes,
and if you're my leader and I need to step up on the results that I'm delivering, and I see that you care, I also now feel a sense of shared accountability because you want to help me. So you're in this with me. You're kind of getting in the mud with me. And now I feel more committed, more in the game because of your leadership style, your approach, which, as you said, is both head and heart. So I love that. It's also a good segue into another pillar, which is performance management. So why don't you go and unpack that pillar, performance management?
Absolutely. I think that there's probably a disconnect most in the world, and that second part, or that last part that says, what gets recognized gets repeated. I feel very strongly that people will lean into anybody that's going to take the time to say, "Hey, well done." right? They're going to lean into that person because in today's world, there's a lot of negativity, and I don't like to live in that space. And so I'm looking for every opportunity to catch people doing things right. At the same time, a manager and a leader has to have the intestinal fortitude to pull someone aside and go, hey, listen, you're on the wrong path, and this path doesn't lead anywhere good. Okay, let's get you redirected. One of my favorite books of all time was The 1 Minute Manager. And it really unpackaged the idea, the concept of going, hey, here's where I need you to go. Here's how I need you to get there. And then every so often, bumping them back into the right direction where they're, hey, listen, you're doing a great job. Pace is good. Direction's good. Or, hey, what are you doing over there in the cornfield? Come back over here real quick. Let's get you back on the path. And that book is so functional, and I've given it away and I've taught from it many, many times, because when I start spending time with managers and you start asking those types of questions about, hey, listen, how do you praise and hold folks accountable? They don't have a defined process. They don't have a, clearly, measured way. One of my favorite things I learned from a company I worked for, they talked about coaching by walking around. We're not talking about documented coaching. We're talking about like basketball coaching, like where you blow the whistle and you call a timeout and you give people positive feedback in the minute. That's a perfect way to pull up and make that jump shot. Hey, what are you doing? You're missing this guy over here. Like that blow the whistle moment gives you the opportunity to have conversations while work is getting done. And too many managers avoiding conflict, sitting in their office, or just not going out and coaching by walking around, are missing those opportunities to help their teams move faster by recognizing the things that are done right, and also catching folks so they don't go too far down a path that they don't belong. Now, I've got a philosophy. It's not my philosophy. I stole it. Recognition has got some steps. Okay. Number one, okay, you got to recognize in a timely manner. You can't do it 2-3 weeks later. Number two, you got to recognize specifically, hey, on this day at this time, you did something that was noteworthy. And best and most beneficial is if you can do it in a public setting where their peers are having the opportunity to kind of bask in that joint success. Okay, you'll win every single time, and being consistent with it.
And Daniel, these principles apply whether you're leading people in an office environment or in a virtual environment, right?
Did it in the military, did it virtually, did it down the hallways of our call center. It transcends everything.
Yep. Okay. Another pillar of yours, of course, is training and development. And I think all organizations understand the importance and the value of training and development. It's not always executed the way that it can be and should be. And so I'd love to hear your approach to training and development.
Absolutely. I believe strongly that none of us is as smart as all of us, right? And especially when you're working in a team environment where there's an opportunity for folks to lift each other up, rising tides raise all ships. I work very hard to create a shared training environment where everyone else, and I stole that from the military. The military is probably the best in the world of doing things like this. Basically, you depend on the fellow and the lady left and right of you. And because of that, you're wanting them to be able to work and perform at a higher rate. If you're better at something, okay, you teach that. If someone else is better at something else, they teach that. And, we all start moving faster because of it. So the first thing is you got to have an atmosphere where people feel comfortable going, I don't know, right? I don't know. I'm not good at this. Can you help me with this? And that's like the very first part. And that's sometimes just you being humble enough to go, hey, listen, can I sit down next to you for a couple minutes? I'm not really familiar with this system, or I'm not really familiar with this process. And can you walk me through it? People like nothing more than being able to show off to their supervisor or their boss of all the things that they know. So that creates a really comfortable environment where they can teach and train. The cornerstone of training for me is repetition. And so I will go out of my way to teach core concepts and key concepts to my teams and my managers. And I found myself, I call myself a meme manager, okay? And I didn't know I was a meme manager. I grew up with my grandparents saying these things like, don't cut off your nose to spite your face, these little things that they picked up over the years. Well, I've just kind of adopted those things over time. So we'll have a meeting and something will happen. I said, listen, you need to begin with the end in mind. Well, that's not my thought. That was 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, right? But I hung on to that and I put it into the conversation is so often that now I hear my people saying those things back to me. but those things have a purpose. So my teaching is built on this repetition. I'll have someone come to me and go, hey, listen, I was beginning with the end in mind. If we're going to do this, here's some things that we probably need to consider. And for me, that's like the happiest thing in the world. And that first thing where I said that you've got to have an expectation. The second thing he said you got to communicate that expectation. Well, ultimately speaking, just because you have an expectation and you put that out there doesn't mean everybody's going to reach that expectation on day one. So if you don't have an intentional thought around how you're going to get your folks up to the right level and execute at that level as consistently as possible, you're always going to be frustrated, and so is your team. And so, number one, I try to create an environment where everyone loves to teach each other because we're vulnerable and we don't have any problems admitting that we don't know something. And number two, I love the consistency of doing some of the core things over and over again. Once again, I like to use basketball. Many years ago, I played basketball. We ran the same drill 100 times. Right? Hey, blow the whistle, do it again. Blow the whistle, do it again. At some point, you were doing it in your sleep. You were dreaming about it. And that was what winning looked like. And so as you're trying to get core things done the same way repeatedly, that's a key element of that is that repetition piece. And at the end of the day, that last thing that I talked about. And then every time they get it right, blow the whistle and tell them about it. Great job. That's what it's supposed to look like.
You know, Daniel, at iCore, we're committed to the active learning approach to training and development for our agents, preparing them to go out on a production floor. And it occurs to me that beginning with the end in mind is exactly the approach that we're taking with active learning. So I love that mantra, and can be applied in so many ways, especially in this context of training and development. So thank you for sharing that. And then your last pillar, Daniel, of course, is morale and recognition. So why don't you unpack that pillar for us?
You know, for me, it kind of touches on that last piece that I was talking about, but on that, as a leader of an organization, and fundamentally, if you're kind of new in your job and you're really not in that leadership kind of mindset yet, you're just trying to hit the numbers. One of the thermometers or barometers that should be on the top of your list always is morale. And a lot of folks believe, and this is one of those kind of boilerplate moments for me, because you look at the economy, you look at the turnover rate, you look at the complexity out there in the workforce today of, you know, competing for some of the same top talent. You know, morale can make or break an organization. If folks don't feel appreciated, they don't feel like what they're doing has value, or you see what they're doing has value, you know, you've lost before you even got started. And I think that, you know, we were talking about earlier in one of my, you know, larger group settings, why leaders don't like meetings. And sometimes meetings become this kind of drag on our calendar, and it makes it difficult to get our job done. But when I start thinking about, you know, meetings with my team and how that positively impacts morale, having those very structured meetings where I'm able to pull everybody together, establish how, you know, get that feeling, that barometer of how everybody's feeling, but then redirect them, get them focused on what's most important, and then, you know, take that walk with them as an organizational leader, that to me has provided probably the most benefit that I get to have at any given time with my teams. And so I spend a lot of time teaching my managers how to have effective meetings, so that from a morale standpoint, they are constantly touching the things that are most important. And if you have a good meeting, you're recognizing people. You're having a good meeting, you're talking about the areas of the business that we're winning. If you're having a good meeting, you talk about the things that we're not doing as well, but you're expressing hope and confidence that we're going to get there. And if you're having a good meeting, people walking out of there with a renewed sense of focus.
Fantastic. Well, Daniel, you've touched on all these pillars of leadership. So let's put a bow on it. Why don't you just kind of wrap it up? And, you know, when you look at the current state of customer experience, customer service, there's a lot of technology involved. Yes, there's still a lot of human involved, right? That's why we have Irresistible in the name of this podcast. But there's a lot of technology involved. And of course, you can't go anywhere and spend even an hour in your day without hearing the word AI. So how do these 5 pillars all come together in a world of technology and AI and all that?
Absolutely. In my prior life, where I live now, I was a director of IT, and it was very interesting when I moved over to the CX space and I became a CX leader for my company. I really thought it was very interesting because I'd go to the conferences and they felt very much like a tech conference. To your point, we were talking about AI and machine learning and all of these different technologies that were merging together to make the customer experience better. And I'd go back and I would look at my organization, and we were using tech stacks and that kind of stuff. And I realized quite quickly that, number one, we were using technology to improve the customer experience. And a lot of times the explanation of how that worked for our teams just wasn't clear enough. They just didn't understand the value of the technology. And so when you started to bring in other stuff or upgrade things, they didn't realize it. And so number one, I felt like it was really important in today's world to make sure that you take the time, in simple terms, but in today's world, explain why the technology is a great accelerator. That's the term that I stole from somebody, and I love it. The technology that we have right now is not replacing jobs. It's making the folks that are doing the jobs better, right? And ultimately, the customer's winning from that. And the second thing, as we started looking at some of these, technology that's moving faster than I ever remember it moving, as a thought leader, but also as an organizational leader, me dedicating time so I understand what is happening and how it's going to impact our customer, our company, and our associates, is probably one of the most important things that I do. So that when we are having these meetings and we are having these conversations about, how we plan on getting more efficient and how we help more customers and how do we improve the customer user experience and the customer experience, me bridging the gap between what we're doing and what my associates understand their role in that is, could probably has never been more important. And so that's what I feel strongly about as we move forward with all, and we're in a huge transition phase right now with technology ourselves. I ultimately spend more time translating the value proposition of what it is we're doing and the why more than I do anything else.
Communicating,
Yes,
and more communication. Love it.
Yeah.
Love
Yes,
it.
sir.
That's great. Thank you, Daniel. Well, Daniel, before we get to the fun question, which we are going to get to in just a moment, that's our final question. Why don't you share with our listener, as well as with those that are watching on video, how can people just connect with you and get into your world?
There's a lot of places and spaces nowadays to connect with folks, but I've been really leaning into my LinkedIn right now. So if you just message me on LinkedIn, I'm very active there. I respond back quickly with folks and have set up a ton of meetings through my LinkedIn profile. And I think that's probably the best place to do that. Fantastic.
Well, those that are watching can see it on screen. Those that are listening, just scroll over to the show notes, and Daniel's LinkedIn profile will be linked up there. Well, Daniel, I alluded to the fun question. On the Digitally Irresistible podcast, we do have the tradition of asking our guests at the very end, when you're not working, Daniel, what do you like to do for fun?
I'm a very eclectic person. And right now, what I am doing for fun, and I'm starting to question my sanity just a little bit, but I've got some property out in where I live, and I am planting pumpkins for the fall. So I'm going to sell some pumpkins this fall. So I'm just planting pumpkins. And so I've nerded out all the way down to, germination time, growth time, seasonal, calendars, planting zones. Like I'm all into some pumpkins right now. I know more about pumpkins than probably I ever thought I would, but that's what I'm doing for fun right now, is some aggressive pumpkin gardening.
Wow, that's very cool. I have to ask you this question again come wintertime, after that fall season is behind you. But right now, we'll take that answer. I like that answer. It's very creative, and it's a first. It's definitely a first here on the podcast. So, Daniel, I just want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me on this episode of the Digitally Irresistible podcast. I love your balanced approach to CX leadership with head and heart. I think it really is making an impact on leaders' ability to lead, and of course, the frontline folks who are doing the job every single day, being on the front line to be able to deliver great CX and great customer service. So thank you so much, Daniel.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Digitally Irresistible podcast, where we cover the optimization of digital technologies and irresistible people, delivering a great employee and customer experience that has a measurable impact on the business. Brought to you by iCore. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast player so you don't miss future episodes.